Well, good morning, Kaila June. I'm so happy to see you here today. This is Meet the Evolvers, and today I'm really happy to talk to Kaila about her wonderful creations. Kaila is the founder of the Somatic School and the developer of Somatic Groundwork, which is a somatic movement practice to restore our natural being and come home to the intimacy of our living bodies. Kaila, is there anything else you'd like to add to that introduction, or just say hello to everybody?
Well, it's great to be here. I always enjoy spending time with you, Elizabeth. And I was just reflecting on, I think it was maybe 2019 that we might have met in the biotensegrity, embodied biotensegrity community. I think it was, around 2019. So it's fun to be several years later and to have met in these online spaces and to have developed a friendship through these virtual webs.
Yes, it really is. And that's really the good side of the internet, I think, and which is really what I wanted to talk with you about today. This whole series is about what people are doing to evolve culture. Mm-hmm. And we all know that the internet can be one of the most horrific, separating kinds of spaces. And what has really concerned me over the whole COVID years that we've been struggling through is how disconnected people feel. But, both in our connection and also in what you're creating, you're really doing the opposite of that. So that's what I'm really inspired about. Kaila has created a relationally healing container for people in a virtual space through somatic work, and then through connecting with each other in ways where we can really feel the safety to be able to be real with each other, vulnerable with each other, and what that can mean in terms of creating a different kind of community. So, Kaila, I guess the first thing I want to ask you about is, the role of somatics in being able to create this safe virtual community, and people being able to jump beyond the normal inhibitions that we might have about meeting each other through these virtual spaces. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think the first place that we have to start is to kind of unpack this idea of somatics a little bit, right? Because there's a lot of different ways to frame what somatics is. Typically it's considered a field that kind of organizes various, body-mind therapies, especially those that have kind of emerged in the West. Thomas Hanna is given the credit for the actual naming of the term somatics. Somatics is in a lot of fields though now. So somatic movement field, it's in therapy, it's in various change theories and social movements. There's somatic bodywork techniques. So it's a pretty wide and diverse web that somatics casts. But if we even go further back, if we go back before somatics was coined, or we go back before the body mind was in such separate camps, we can see this kind of base way of humans relating to all of life, and this kind of just base relationality, which I think is what somatics really kind of is wanting to help us return to, right? To kind of come back to being in relationship, not only with other humans, but with all of the living beings and things and that there are. So I just kind of wanted to name that, because when we're talking about utilizing somatics or a somatic container in these virtual spaces, for me, what's really happening there is about leaning into relationality. And what does it mean to feel good about being in relationship with one another? And how do we do that when we're not even in the same room together, right? When I'm not able to hear you breathe, or I'm not able to pick up on your vibrations through my own vibrational field and my own fascial system, which I know you and I, get really excited about the opportunities of relating there. Like when we don't have that and we're not actually in the space, when I can't see what your eyes are doing, right? I can't watch your body language in the same way because people kind of get stuck when they come into Zoom, right? Then how do we get into relationships here in this space?
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you really unpacked somatics a bit for us, and what I'm hearing in that is really what somatics means to you and what's at the core of what you do. I also relate to that really deeply, and I think that our mutual connection through the biotensegrity groups has it's kind of created the opportunity for all of us to realize that this architecture of life is something that we share with all living beings. Mm-hmm. And certainly for me, it's brought me into a much greater appreciation for how we all go through this process of coming into form and growing a body and adapting to the challenges that we face and what that looks like on a physical level. And for me, the other thing about biotensegrity that's been so wonderful is that it's given me a sense of how my own ability to regulate myself, whether I'm in a virtual space or face to face. This is something that is inherently in my knowing, in my realm of being an embodied living soul. And so for me, somatics holds that potential for us all as well. Mm-hmm.
Which reminds us that we're not an isolated event, right? My ability to self-regulate comes from the fact that I'm in relationship with the body of Earth.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm.
Yes. I am elemental in that sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just love that we're talking about it because I think that, as somatics is gaining a little bit more traction in terms of people kind of, their ears are now perking when they hear the word somatic. 4 years ago when I brought my work online, I didn't really use the word somatics because it was a confusing word still at the time, I felt, so that was the beginning of 2018. Even though I've been, involved in somatic movement, for a couple of decades, I was just like trying to find the words that would bring people in instead of kind of, confuse people and not, where they wouldn't open the door. But, 4 years later, it's very, very different environment. The word somatics is kind of like natural or organic, or it's kind of exciting for people. And they're like perking up and tuning in and, leaning into, well, what does this mean? And I think that the kind of a first phase that I'm seeing is the use of somatics that continues to still centers me and my ego. And it's about my inner sensations and inner feelings and who I am and how I'm doing. And of course, inquiry begins with understanding this, right? It's problematic though, if it stops there. And that's the idea that somatics is about the self, right? About myself. It's really about relationship, and through our self, what I hope and what I encourage in somatic inquiry is that through this deepening of relationality with ourselves, we come or remember ourselves back into connection with the whole circle. Through me, I remember how we are connected. I remember how we are in breath together. I remember that we are in a shared community, right?
Yes, very important point, because it's really takes it to a different structure of consciousness, away from this is about me and my personal healing, and that is a piece of it, certainly, but it's a piece that exists within this greater interconnectivity, interbeing that we share.
Yeah.
And I think the true healing, for me at least, lies in that, in realizing that this John Gebser wrote a wonderful book about evolution, the evolution of consciousness, called The Ever-Present Origin. And so just saying that I'm remembering that this ever-present origin is alive within me always, before and beyond the small me, the small sense of self. And that this is also what connects me to everyone. This ever-present origin lives in all beings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Gary David, who was married to Emily Conrad, founder of Continuum, Gary David calls somatics the soul. That it really means the soul, the embodied soul. And that is the piece that I'm speaking to with the ever-present origin. If somehow that somatics, for me, this embodiment that happens is a gateway to this larger realization of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely, like, I can feel that as an experience in me as I kind of like just review and track. Like I remember the very first class where I was introduced to somatic inquiry, I was 18, 19, something like that. So if I kind of track that journey, which has really become synonymous with my spiritual path or spiritual being, I have this sense too of, this somatic inquiry helping me to move through time, space, right? So it's that kind of like inside out, this toroidal flow, even, if you will, right? Really bringing me into the presence of that. And just, for anybody that's listening, it doesn't have to be that esoteric or eccentric. It can get really transpersonal, right? But then there's also some real practicality for doing the practices.
We can invaginate into all sorts of spaces. Sometimes you can just like roll around on the floor and you felt like shit before, and you get up and you go, oh yes, I'm me. I'm home to myself again. Mm-hmm. So that is invaluable.
Absolutely. And, so in terms of practicality, we can connect that into being such an accessible way to get at, helping our autonomic system back into regulation. And again, we're doing that. We could call that a self-regulation, environmental regulation. If we're doing this in practice together, we could bring in that co-regulation, but it just taps right into both our nervous system and our fascial matrix. And it does its own regulating all on its own by simply being in the presence of, in the relationship of, tracking the feedback from. And we go into soft body rolling for 5, 10, 15 minutes. We stand up and there's been an emergent becoming. It's what I call it, a shift, right? We've had a phase shift in our entire self, which then also, influences how we can be in relationship. There's a way that it brings us back into connection too, like our fascial web. Sometimes I think about it as our fascial web seamlessly, weaving and winding into the bigger matrices that we can't see, and on it goes, right? Like,
yes. Yeah, because you're more available for yourself. I mean, this phase shift is actually a physical thing, as we know from our studies of biotensegrity and the fourth dimensional qualities of matter being, we can go from solid to gel, from fluid to more gelatinous. We can change the density in our bodies, thereby making us more accessible to ourselves. And how can we be relational when we're cut off from that part of us?
Right.
So it just makes so much sense.
It does.
It's like, duh. And the thought that it's natural is another piece, that this is a capacity that is a natural thing that we are given. It's a gift that we hold as having a body, being a living creature.
Right. I mean, I think that's another thing that's interesting about like the more contemporary field of somatics is the reason that these practices are so, they're medicine for us is because we don't live in that same way, right? Many people don't go outside in a given day, might not even ever really look out the window and connect with the living world. We wear shoes, we have clothes, we drive cars. There's many, many layers of the technosphere between us and the soil, right? So we've removed ourselves in a way from this base relationship. And it's not that we can't access it or return to it, but it does require, at least I experience in my life as a modern human, that practice is a requirement, right? That I need to practice daily in some capacity, whether it's, a 5-minute check-in or it's that soft body rolling on the floor for, 15 minutes or more, or all of the things, that can be done to keep us in tune, with it.
Yeah.
With it all. And,
I have a daily practice. I'm so happy to hear that you agree it's a daily thing. I mean, there's some days, like if I'm traveling or something, I don't get that. But the thing is, you can always drop in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, go to the bathroom and close the stall and shake.
Yeah.
There's just so many ways we can plug back into that. And I notice, it does make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for real. And I love yawning and pandiculating in public. I'm like, the sooner we all just start doing this and allow ourselves to unwind spontaneously, the better we're all going to feel.
Yes. Like, when did we stop that? You look at little kids just out there in the middle of Walmart or something, and there's no inhibition there.
Yeah.
This whole process of enculturation, of putting the armor on and the chains on, is something that I think we're all seeing the destructive qualities of that now.
Right.
The golden shadow of the pandemic is that we're reevaluating everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was talking to my nephew yesterday, who's having a rough go right now, and I relate. It's challenging. It's a challenging time, And I said to him, I was like, well, it sure would be a lot easier if we could still just simply go to the fire and sing and dance and drum. Like, we'd be all good. Like,
yeah.
It's actually all that we need, right? And I said, but there's so many layers and constructs on top of us to actually get there and to be able to have that possibility together. There's repair work, and again, this just remembering we got to stay awake long enough to go, oh yeah, that's a good way to metabolize all the things and come back into base relationship and connection. Let's gather around the fire and sing and dance and drum.
It's easy to do that, and we can make that shift, and we forget that. There's a great book out. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called The Dawn of Everything. It's a really thick, like 500-page book written by an anthropologist and an archaeologist. And so the idea here is that it's looking at how these assumptions have shaped us. But what we're only seeing is this very narrow window of Western white European culture. And that's our frame for history. And so he goes back in the first part of the book, they're talking about how many of the concepts for the Constitution were not taken from European Enlightenment. European ideas of Enlightenment were taken from Native American tribes, especially the ones in the Northeast of America, because that's kind of where they were. And these these tribes there were amazing intellectuals that came over into European cafe society and debated and lectured and really changed a lot of thought. But one of the ideas is this idea of the fluidity of the culture, so that they were seasonal. So sometimes they would go and they would live in small tribes, extended families, really, and they would have certain ways within their culture of being. Maybe they had a social system that was totally hierarchical. And then they would, in the winter, they would go and there would be gatherings of hundreds of people, different tribes, and they'd live in these long houses together. And the society completely changed, so that maybe you had a king for 3 months, and people had different names, different customs, different ways of dressing and behaving. And they just did whatever worked for whatever situation they found themselves in. They were completely fluid. And then you look at where we are today and you realize, well, we've really been cheated in thinking that the way that Western culture is has to be it, that it can't change, that we don't have the ability to be equally fluid in changing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sometimes wonder if that's the hardening around a human-centric worldview. Just
yes, yeah,
right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so interesting. So if I could backtrack just a little bit, because you mentioned earlier about your first class in somatic inquiry. Mm-hmm. I would love to hear if you would share with us a little bit about your personal journey, about how did you get to where you are today? What was your passion, your motivation in pursuing this?
Well, it starts with growing up in a studio that my mom owned. So grown up dancing my whole life and was teaching really young, first helping assist my mother with classes. And then by the time I was a teenager, I had half the classes on the schedule. They were mine as she delegated the smaller, kids to me. It was the same thing with my sister. So that was a real blessing to grow up both dancing and teaching. And my mom was also a real creative spirit. So she was, just like really supportive in us all dance making, and then performing those dances at the regular performances that we would do all over the community. And she wanted to get dance out in every nook and cranny possible. So we performed in a lot of different kinds of spaces, and we got to perform our own dances sometimes. So that's very, very special beginning there. I took some time off after high school, but eventually I did end up in a dance department at the University of Montana. And that's where I was introduced to modern dance and contemporary dance. And I was so grateful to take my point shoes off and take my tights off and take my hair out of a bun and start moving with the floor and be barefoot and essentially wear whatever I wanted to in multiple layers to class. And so it began, improvisation and performance art and somatic movement research. It was such a wonderful awakening, I think, to realize, again, this like deepening into what dance actually is as a base expressive form for us. My mom had a really significant low back injury when I was a child, which really affected me because she was in a lot of pain and she had to teach dance lying on a bed for many years because of that back injury. We had a bed in our living room that she also lived on. She couldn't stand or walk for very long. So really changed our life. And that happened when I was 10. And so then when I had my first low back injury, which, was SI joint dysfunction of one kind or another in my early 20s, it really sent a lot of fear through me. And I started looking around and seeing that so many of the peers that I was dancing with, they were also injured and in pain half of the time. And it really started to concern me. One, like, am I going to be able to recover? Am I going to feel better? Like my mom had a long, long journey with this. And then also what's going on within the training of dancers, that this is happening to us in our, teens and 20s. And So many people actually have debilitating lives after their dance careers. They never really feel good in their body again because of what dance training and performing, did to their tissue architecture. So I was able to recover, and it got me really interested about dance injury and prevention. So I really started leaning into dance kinesiology, started doing laboratories with a good friend of mine. We just really went into exploration of all of the somatic methods and modalities that we could get our hands on, but also all of these questions about how can we do this better? How does this happen in a different way? How do we participate in shifting what dance training is all about? So that was very informative. I had an opportunity to work with a lot of different people individually and do just a lot of exploration around it, a lot of laboratory type exploration around it, while also, continuing to make dance and perform every chance that I could with all kinds of artists. So interdisciplinary artists as well. But the other really important thing for me in terms of somatic journey is that in my late 20s, probably somewhere around 28 or something, I was in an authentic movement experience with a friend. So for those that aren't familiar with authentic movement, it's a particular kind of dance therapy, somatic modality. Mary Whitehouse Starks is one of those founders of authentic movement. So I was in an authentic movement session with a friend. It was just her and I in the studio on a weekend day. The whole dance department was quiet. And I contacted something which essentially was my memory returned of my childhood. And I didn't realize that I didn't remember much before the age of 10 or so. But my memory came back about the sexual abuse of my stepfather, and the fact that I was in my late 20s and had no idea. And nobody in my family had any idea. It was crushing, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, how is it that I can be this age and not know so many things about my own life path? So that took me into all of the questions about how to heal trauma and what is memory and how is this stored in my body, and led me down into a whole other, somatic inquiry pathway that eventually brought me into ritual and ceremony and shamanism. And I spent about 5 years with a teacher and a group of women working through. First, it was about really working through that trauma, but then it became about so much more and really opened me up into all of the nested fields of trauma or pain that goes back and back and back and back, and all along I was developing somatic groundwork, Elizabeth. So somatic groundwork's just been developing with me along my path, just parallel to it, really named it when I was, early 20s, and it just continued to be movement medicine for me and was informed by my experiences that I was moving through. And also I just was always sharing it and teaching it. I was using it to help people feel better. I was using it to help people find more creative expression. We were using it to create, dance, dance choreography, improvisation. It was used there as well. So it became like this really important and essential partner in my life. And then, I moved and I got into exercise science and personal training. And so then I added in this whole other exercise science piece to this deep background of dance and improvisation and somatic study. And really what brought me to where I am now is this desire to, continue to blend these, the science and art of movement as I've been able to study it or participate with it, to make sense of it, and to help other movement teachers with their own questions. And I would say finally that, probably one of the most important things for me is to say, okay, within movement education, let's make sure that this somatic inquiry sticks and stays. I don't want to see our practice of movement be so objectified and be so outside in. How can we really use this in a more meaningful way And that's really, having somatic inquiry as kind of the base for our movement practice and expression.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, it's beautiful. I didn't know that story about your history. And one of the things, well, first of all, I want to say thank you for sharing that. One of the things that struck me was that we have some parallel tracks in our lives. I had been a choreographer and dancer, and then I went to healing school. And when I was in healing school, I was having a miscarriage. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was having a miscarriage. And the head of the healing school worked on me. And she said to me during the midst of this, "Do you know you were sexually abused?" She saw it in my energy field. Well, that was manifesting itself as a part of the miscarriage. And still, I had no idea about the abuse. And so I remember later going back to my father. My mother was no longer alive. And I asked him about this, and he denied that it ever happened, which was another symptom of the whole. This was my uncle, who had been a serial abuser of the women intergenerationally. And it was all never spoken of. It was all held in complete denial. So that gave me more information about how there was no way that I could cognitively access this memory. And so I remember going back and lying on the floor in my studio for a year, and just, I said, I don't want to move in any way that is something that somebody else has, is a technique that somebody else has imposed upon me. I'm going to lie still if I have to until the first impulse to move arises in me. And so I did. And, I was still for a long time. But when I started to move, it was a spiral. It was a wave. It was just this flutter of something. And so I stayed with that for a year. And, all sorts of memories came as there was like a sense of the patterns, the energetic patterns being released. And as it was releasing out of my field, there'd be this fragment of memory. And had I not known what had happened, or perhaps happened for myself intuitively before, I would have associated that thought as some kind of non sequitur, like, where did that come from? But I knew that they were all pieces of the puzzle. So I just noted that, and it was a very natural process, I have to say. And I began seeing like how that had been held in me, and it influenced everything in me without me being conscious of it. The way that I moved, the way that I related to men, the way that I spoke or actually was afraid to speak, and how I sort of wore this armor. So I saw that, and I saw the future possibilities of me continuing or me freeing myself up and letting this be a part of me, but not defining me anymore. And that opened up all other things, so that my sense of time and space shifted to this kind of open, where you could access in the present all these things. And then there was this sense of not this place that was never wounded, didn't have to carry any of it, that kind of interconnectedness, that origin that was ever present. And I realized I could start to reorient myself to some bigger sense of who I was beyond all of that. And, I really feel like that's the sort of thing that's possible when we just lie down and go deep inside and let movement emerge.
Wow, really incredible story, Elizabeth. Yeah, so much. Just like I think about magic, and magic is real. It's the invisible happenings, these invisible forces, really, and there's not I've long since given into the mystery of needing to know why and what. And that's another gift of the somatic path, is instead, like kind of like resting in the process of it unfolding. And it doesn't mean that there's going to be revealed this absolute truth in that. And in fact, I don't think that's the case at all, because we have so many imprints and residues and sticky this and that and narratives and, things on us. However, continuing to stay with the process unfolding, it certainly does allow us to continue to peel back the onion, ask different questions, get curious about new things, discover what we wouldn't have discovered, and I think we get to know how to be with life in a really, unique way then too.
And as I'm listening to what you're saying, I'm realizing all the more important to have a container, a safe container to be held in this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's, for me, I think the skill set got a lot more refined once I started teaching virtually, because of the things that we named earlier on, right? And especially because I'll have workshops and I'll teach live events where I don't know everybody coming. I also have other groups where we know each other really well. But I also, have other, things that I hold where I don't know anything about most of the people coming. And so, it's like, okay, what's my responsibility in holding and facilitating a space so that each person has has the ability to really journey safely. What are the ingredients that I need to include in setting up these containers so that there really can be self-agency within the practice. And because we start moving ourselves into this territory, our somatic territory, we start coming into, slithering through the wilderness of ourselves. We never really know who we're going to meet, how the journey is going to be. So there, the great piece about it though, is that if we have a few fundamental ingredients, we have what I, offer as grounding resources. We have kind of the beginning skill set of learning to track and note and then we can choose whether or not we want to go the next step, or whether we go, oh, okay, hey, yeah, not today, I'll see you later. And that's okay to say, it's okay to do that.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, because inevitably, when I'm holding a workshop, a somatic workshop, I know that there's all of these beings in their own space, in their room or outside, wherever they're practicing, and I don't know what else they have.
And this is where somebody can go really deep and maybe get in the weeds.
Yeah. I want to avoid flooding at all costs, I know what that experience is. I know what it's like to be untethered. And, those are experiences where really the one-on-one environment, or at least having some practice and skill set with the lighter stuff first, allows for us to then get into these bigger experiences,
Yeah.
Yeah, what are the things that, need to be offered so that somebody, doesn't go get lost in their wilderness.
Right. So what are some of those essential things that need to be in place? You mentioned grounding. You mentioned having the choice not to go there. I mean, for instance, so grounding techniques. Absolutely. I agree with that. Is there something specifically, like if somebody's starting to deal with some material that they don't want to go to, is it just saying to them, you don't have to go there enough? Or is there something that they can do to bring themselves back, open their eyes, ground again, for instance?
I guess first I want to frame it that, in creating the somatic container and dropping into practice is really naming that we're in a field of relationships, and that we are one of those subjects in a whole field of relationships. And there's a conversation that I like to have about regulation, how we can do practices that help regulate our own nervous systems. And those things we have to have the will to do, whether that's a breathing practice or any number of somatic techniques, whether I'm going to chant or sing, or I'm going to keep coming back to the soft body rolling on the floor. You talked about shaking or bouncing, right? Like these actions I can take to help with self-regulation. We also, though, can regulate very well with our environment. So I like to really open up that relational field as well, and what that means and how we use our eyes, and a practice of seeing, an exploration of seeing, and how we connect to the living world through our eyes. And sometimes that's actually the easiest and quickest way to regulate. Yes. And I think this is an important part of somatic practice too. A lot of people will go right into an eyes closed place without really having access to environmental regulation through eyes. So we have a conversation about that. And then if I'm guiding and facilitating, I also talk about the co-regulation that's happening here, even though we're not in the same space. Through the webs, through this greater field, we are in co-regulation, not just me to you, but you to me. And then however many of us are here together, we're choosing on purpose, intentionally to be here and practice together. So we are in a field together. And so that really starts to just change somebody's space for practice, already brings in a bigger scope of relationship that then they can choose to what degree to participate with. Yeah. And so then when we start talking about grounding resources, and what is grounding, is relationship with earth, relationship with space. And so now this is a relationship. It's not just a thing that I use for me,
Important. Yeah,
like I'm in reciprocity with this other grand elemental, and it's actually the reason for my existence.
And it's providing you with support.
Yeah, right. And so then we do some felt sense exploration with that. So people can start kind of naming a few things in their body as I take them through an initial grounding, to bring in then that feedback loop back up into mind. Okay, here's some words, right? So, those are just a few things, but then, so if somebody's in practice, I'll just mention this as we're going into practice. I'm like, if you get lost, you don't know where you are, and suddenly you're like not really feeling all that secure or comfortable, then pause. Use a regulation technique, open your eyes, regulate with the environment, come back into that felt sense of what it's like to be in relationship with earth and space. Sometimes I'll also bring in breath, but as we know, sometimes breath is more problematic than it is helpful, but for a lot of people, it's still a good doorway, right? And then sometimes I'll also, in the beginning of a practice, ask people, depending on kind of what we're doing and maybe where the skill level is of the groups, this might be something I'll do more in a series, is, what is it to actually create your own resource, and that might include imagery and sensation or smell. It might be a place, it might be a person, it could be an animal. Is there somewhere, because most of us have something like that, right? We can go into kind of an image, felt sense, sensory experience of a place or the warmth of a person, and we can just go right there. We can take our whole selves right there. Yeah. Right. So we come with these resources, and when we start practice, and then I name that, just continue to remind people that if you get lost, you lose your attention, you lose your awareness, you don't like what's happening, you contact something that you're uncomfortable with, and you don't have the ability to move in or stay with it, you can just come back here, here, like here,
Yeah.
Hands to body can be a really great grounding way. So we'll sometimes do some tactile stuff, yeah. So, I mean, it's just super basic, right? But it's kind of learning how to be in the process with it. It's like you wouldn't go into the wilderness, or at least, I hope you wouldn't like go take a hike into the wilderness without, some essential things, right? Like you're probably going to need an extra layer in case it rains, or if it gets cold, or, you're thinking about your footwear. Most of us, you're going to maybe have a water bottle, maybe you have a backpack with a snack in it. You're going to have a flashlight, you're going to have a knife, you're going to have some things. So that's essentially what it is. Like, how can I help you kind of fill a backpack with some things while you're in the journey?
Beautiful. Beautiful. And what about co-regulation? Is there an opportunity for, I don't know, putting something in the chat? Hey, can we FaceTime or?
Yeah. So depending on the workshop, I'll often use the chat box as a way to share, various things, like give a very simple, easy prompt and see how, interested people are in using the chat. Every group's a little bit different. If the group is small enough, or if we're going to do a series, then we might actually do some, very kind of like simple check-in to get voices to come into the space. Usually groups that are meeting repeatedly, we do a lot more of that, so we can really get to know each other. And there's other techniques too, in terms of like, how do we actually relate with the digital thing in front of us and the Zoom boxes, and what is this, and how can we come into relationship with this differently? So there's a couple of different, fun practices that I'll sometimes bring into just to, to like just name like, hey, yeah, it's kind of strange. You were just alone in your room, and then, you turn on the Zoom link and now 50 other people are with you. Let's settle into that. Yeah. How do you feel being seen? How do you feel seeing other people? Like, let's talk about this a little bit, so you can choose how you're going to participate with this thing.
I'm hearing lots of options, lots of choices, and the importance of talking about that, so that people are equipped to know that they have all of these at their disposal. Yeah. It's beautiful.
I mean, Zoom's not going away, right?
I don't think so.
I mean, I felt fortunate that, I was kind of 2 years into having an online platform before the pandemic. So I didn't have to do a quick learn like so many of my peers and colleagues, did. So I feel really grateful for that. And now 2 years into it, I'm like, oh, okay, this is going to be a new reality for most of us. Yeah. To some extent. So let's keep playing with it. Let's keep talking about it. Let's keep finding out how it is that we're going to use this so that it's meaningful and it's not depleting and draining and all of the things. Of course, we need real living life body stuff too. Feet on the earth, smelling the air, arms around a tree. Like, we need that too. And this is also a part of our communication and relationship.
Well, the opportunity to expand our connections is so great with it. And I love the irony of using a virtual space to get real.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So that's where we are. And it's actually very evolutionary, because you're including something that was so basic, and now including some technological opportunity that we have, and bringing those both together. What you've combined, in combining them, you have something greater than it's not 1 and 1 equals 2, it's 1 and 1 equals 3. Growing new capacities, what's going to emerge in us through using technology in this way. And also, will it help us? And this is my prayer, that it will really help us take the bend, make the curve, steer the ship, just this little shift toward a culture that is more rooted in our interbeing, to use Thich Nhat Hanh's phrase, what that means for us. Something to be discovered.
Yeah, it is not easy to stay awake. It is really not easy to stay awake, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, this just brings us back to practice, whatever that is. And I think getting outside of that, practice needs to somehow be formal or happen so many minutes a day at this time of day. And if I miss those minutes and I miss that time of day, well, shoot, I can't practice today.
Yes.
That's something else that I think this, somatic inquiry teaches us. It's like, no, we can practice in various ways all of the time, at any time.
Yeah.
At any time, we can practice returning back into relationship with ourselves and with the living world. There's a whole host of ways to do it, and if all we have is the few breaths that we can pay attention to, well, then let's use that. Right? Yeah. If it's the walk that I have from my house to my car, or my car to the grocery store, let's do that. If it's my ability to connect with a human through the clerk that's checking me out, well, then I'm going to use this as a practice. Right? I mean, we can sing and move and, make rhythm on our bodies. And it's just like, I think we have to really let's redefine what it means to practice.
Yes. And maybe even the word practice needs to be substituted at some point, because it's like practice being the river. Can I just get to a space where I'm in that flow, and things can arise and dissolve and float by, and I'm still experiencing the flow as my primary state of being. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm reminded of something you talked about early in our conversation about you use the word fluidity, and then you also use the word flexibility. I think it's like such an important quality for us to be cultivating, is the ability to be flexible, right? To be able to be shaped by and to shape without knowing how this shaping is going to happen, right?
Yeah.
But there's, it's a tricky thing, because it's this whole conversation of like losing ourselves and not losing ourselves.
Yes.
Right? It's a conversation of boundaries. Right. And I don't have any answers for that right now, but I do know that, somatic inquiry and this kind of research that we're talking about that exists through our living body and our relationship to the living world, that provides clues, I guess I would say, provides the returning, the remembering within the practice itself. I cannot think my way into that, actually.
Right.
Can't think my way back into the flow, as you were mentioning. I can't think my way into flexibility.
Right.
But I can participate with this moment in a way that then that emerges.
Yeah. Love this talk.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
It's been wonderful, Kaila. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And, I just want to give big appreciation to the voice that you and Bruce bring through all of the webs. And I mean, that's where I know you from, is this weaving of webs and virtual spaces. And it's, I feel my integrity is maintained by knowing people like you and Bruce. Those relationships, being able to witness the two of you doing your work and hear your teachings and feel your presence through the virtual spaces helps me continue to be doing mine.
Thank you. I feel the same about you. I find you and your work really inspirational and important. So I really want to thank you for sharing this time and sharing your story with us. It's beautiful.
You're welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you, my dear. Mwah. Be well.